You're listening to Vote Her In, a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our guest today is Amina Dickerson, the president of Dickerson Global Advisors. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Vote Her In. I am Kelly, and Vote Her In is a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. And I'm going to turn this over now to Rebecca, who will introduce our guest for today. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Kelly, and hi to our very special guest today, Amina Dickerson, who is an amazing woman, another public leader in this wonderful long list of people who have joined us. Women in all facets of public leadership throughout the Vote Her In series. I've known Amina for a long time and watched her lead in the arts, in philanthropy, in pushing for equity for women and African Americans. And so we thought at this time of Black Lives Matter and hopefully a substantial commitment by corporations and governments and others to a much expanded role an opportunity for African Americans, it would be a good time to have Amina join us and talk with us about what she's doing, what she's seeing, what she sees as the priorities. So thank you, Amina, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm delighted to join you and Kelly in this conversation. I think you're right. These are timely conversations for us to have. And this is just the beginning of a lot of work we all have to do collectively to create the changes we'd like to see.
So, I've watched you in your career. I think you came to Chicago sometime in the 80s. And all throughout, you have worked to be a civic leader and to engage others in civic leaders. In civic leadership opportunities, particularly other African American women. And I wondered if you could talk with us, since we began the Vote Her In podcast, talking hoped for our dream of a woman president, if you could talk with us about Joe Biden's upcoming vice presidential choice and the fact that several African American women are in the running. And, share with us and our listeners how you feel about this, both personally and professionally.
Well, thank you for the question. Of course, I think we are a little disappointed that the major candidate is not a woman. This was the most diverse field of people running for that slot of the presidential candidate, and very, very talented people. Think a couple of things. First, that I hope that Joe Biden is going to not only, sort of make the big public commitment to having a woman and possibly a woman of color as his running mate, but I hope that he is going to take more time to listen to the issues that the communities of color and Black women in particular are raising about what needs to happen in the country at this time. I think just to have a candidate run does not sort of check a box and make everything okay. It's much deeper. What are the two of them going to do, the president and the vice president, to really address some of the structural issues, the concerns, the pain that people are feeling throughout the country, particularly when you think about sort of women's role in the workplace, the underrepresentation we have for them in positions of leadership and on boards, and in particular how they are underpaid for doing equal work or underpaid for the service work, the frontline work that they're doing. So among the candidates, I think it's going to be really, really important for them to also, that is the women candidates that he's considering, to have a level of credibility with women of color, African-American women, for them to be a vocal advocate for many of the issues of that I've just spoken about that need to be addressed, particularly as it pertains to social and economic opportunity. And I would pay a lot of attention to their ability to really move and motivate voters to come out on election day. Those are all going to be really important aspects.
And just as a quick follow-up, is there anything that strikes you? You know, we've seen these half a dozen African-American women mayors really at the front lines over these last couple of weeks. Has there been anything that struck you about their place as executive leaders that you think is instructive for this choice of a vice presidential candidate?
Oh, I think there are a couple of things that we can take from the examples of the mayor of Washington, D.C., the mayor of Atlanta, elected officials that have been part of the process of impeachment, et cetera, and their presentations before the nation. First of all, I think that they have been authentically themselves. You know, they've not tried to fit some other external ideal of how they lead. They lead authentically from their own experience and from their deep relationships with their communities. In Washington, D.C., and in Atlanta in particular. These are women who talk deeply about an extent being born in those cities has shaped their perspective of not only themselves and their communities, but of the injustices that they see, that they feel they have a responsibility to address. I love their courage. They are not scared at all of speaking truth to power. And I think that's going to be really important for, again, a presidential candidate to listen carefully to the things that they are saying. And I think they are speaking very, they bring a kind of empathy and a kind of lived experience that we know that women can bring to leadership roles, and they have certainly exemplified that. So, I'm very struck by their capacity to create change on the ground and in their own environments, in their own cities.
When you were heading corporate philanthropy for Kraft, you were doing a lot of work internationally. And this is such an interesting moment, I think, thinking globally. We have a global pandemic and a global recession going on, but at the same time, the U.S. is sort of withdrawing a lot from the world. But what in your work that you've done internationally, what's your sort of a approach to that, and how does that sort of work with the work that you do within the U.S.? How do you think about that connection, and what lessons might we draw from that in this super interesting moment?
Well, it's so interesting. Even before the role at Kraft and working, my first museum job was at the Museum of African Art in Washington. And, the engagement with sub-Saharan Africa, well, with all of Africa, but particularly sub-Saharan Africa at that time. One of the things that I learned very early on is that we have to be very careful of the kind of hubris that Americans bring to situations, assuming that we know what's needed, assuming that we have all of the answers, assuming that we can walk into a situation and know how they are feeling. So one of the things that I learned to practice early on in my work in philanthropy was listening to employees, listening to the representatives of the communities where these factories or operations resided, listening to people who would approach the company for funding, and to understand that the way that we do things is not necessarily going to be 100% applicable, both in terms of the structures and systems of consideration that is applying for a grant, but most importantly, how funds would be applied in ways that would bring longstanding relief or benefit or change to a community. So listening very carefully, developing a sensitivity, I hope, to what were different cultural norms, and learning to be very flexible. You had to co-create this. We couldn't just drop down, from the top down, this is how it's going to go. And that sometimes meant having to negotiate back at headquarters a different way of doing things on behalf of those communities. But if you don't listen, if you don't ask questions, if you're not curious, then certainly you leave a lot on the table that could be really important work to develop and to mine.
One of the things about this is there's such a close connection between this who truly listens and examines, as you've been talking about, and the role of a leader who really confronts a situation like the one we're in today. And of course, that's amplified by the discussion that we're having throughout the world, but certainly here in the U.S. about, bridging racial separation and class differences and all of that that's really just come to the fore because of the pandemic and the current disturbances. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the structural discrimination that you see that, of course, you and I have had lots of chances to discuss over the years. But, in particular, the other day, you and I had a really heartfelt conversation about all of this. And I'm wondering if you could share your views on how you see us moving ahead, listening and thinking, but also interracially, so to speak.
Well, that's a really broad question, Rebecca, and a lot. I guess I feel like there's a lot embedded in that, and part of that has to do with what is our responsibility for helping to affect the changes that we know are ahead. I think in general, I sense that there is a desire on the part of particularly the white community to better understand. And I think on the part of many African Americans, there's also a little bit of education fatigue. That is it my responsibility to educate you about what you don't know? Or is it your responsibility to really take your self-education on and to ask yourself some very, very tough questions about what your assumptions are, what your beliefs are, where you kind of enter the picture. A lot of folks deny that they have any privilege or have any responsibility for where we are today. But when you begin to really read and study and learn about the breadth and depth of the discrimination, of the bias, of the systemic systems that policies that have been in place that have kept African Americans and other people of color in a particular frame of opportunity, a limited frame of opportunity, I think you begin to understand what has to happen, what changes might be there, what reality, what truth is in that. And I also think that we have a way as humans to feel like the changes are okay up to a point. How willing are we individually? And this is part of the discussion I think we were starting to have the other day. How willing are we to acknowledge that we've got to give up some power and some privilege, that resources don't just get shifted without some impact on you individually, and understanding what the contribution to the cause is that each of us must make. I think that is going to be an important element in people having frank and honest discussions about the changes and the way to create those changes ahead. I think the other thing is that people need to understand, we all need to understand that this is going to be a long process. These systems have been in place for, over 400 years in many cases, and certainly the oppression and the attitudinal shifts are going to take some time. So there's got to be a personal commitment to ask ourselves some of these questions over and over again to get to a new reality about how we want to operate and what's necessary, what changes are necessary to make that possible. I think the relationships that we build, the kind of trust and candor that underscore those is going to be really very important. If I can be trusted to tell you the truth, and you can be trusted to tell the truth about where you are, what your perspective is, where we have alignment, where we don't have alignment, what we need to do to shift it, I think those are going to be key to really these issues forward. As somebody said to me just the other day, and I quote her, she said, "We need to foster and create new mental models that acknowledge race racism as, as an immoral concept. And I think that takes a lot of hard work and a lot of courage. This is courageous work. This is not going to come easily. And it's going to be painful. Everybody's going to feel a little bit of pain, but that's where we are, and that's what it's going to require.
Speaking of the pain, just a follow-up, can you talk a little bit about the sort of the scarediness, I guess? I don't know. I think that there's a quotient of fear that certainly all of us have, no matter how well we know each other and how much we want to make change. And I'm particularly, of course, speaking here as a white person who has worked collaboratively in the civil rights movement since the beginning of my career. But this is different, and there's a certain fear factor.
I think part of that fear has to do with understanding that this really is a power shift. This is not a feel-good moment. And so that's where, there's a fear of the unknown. What is this going to mean for me, for my family, for my community? How is it going to be different? What is it going to look like? What will it continue to require of me to give up, to this new ideal? And so some of that fear comes out of just not knowing, and the uncertainty of that. Some of that fear comes from, if I'm totally honest, will I damage a friendship? Will I damage a relationship? Will I be, will there be repercussions for me, particularly in the workplace? And part of it is also a fear of really showing ourselves and how we deeply feel about some of these things. And until we acknowledge where we are, we can't really begin to probe why we have those perspectives, how they were formed, how they were shaped, and what needs to shift in that perspective. So I think, it is about, one of my professor friends talks about brave conversations, courageous conversations. This is what this is going to require, some courageous conversations that, my feelings may get hurt, yours may get hurt, but is that really important in the larger goal that we're after? There's going to be some collateral damage, and we just have to understand that.
So to that point of some of this being unknown, what that might look like and what sorts of privilege we might need to give up, what are some of the policy priorities that you think that these mayors, so we talked earlier about these mayors who are doing such brave work, the things they're talking about, but how do they then sort of take that and put those into policy priorities? They have so many things to balance right now with the pandemic, but also with refiguring out what a police safety and, so I guess what would you suggest that they sort of prioritize in this moment?
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge that I was very neglectful thinking of other cities, Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, and not dealing with where I reside and, the incredible groundbreaking election of Lori Lightfoot, who, came into economic problems. There was a budget deficit. Certainly the policing issue in Chicago has been paramount in thinking of many in community about what needs to change as soon as possible. And then she gets hit with COVID, as our whole nation and world has. What would be the priorities that need to be set here? I think just based on what we have witnessed in the United States and around the globe, we've got to put a very strong priority around rethinking what we mean by the criminal justice system, what that looks like, how that is structured, what are the biases, conscious and unconscious, that have informed our policing practices historically, everything from the bond fund and what that does to lead people down the road to economic disaster for very, very, very often small infractions, not being able to pay parking tickets, this kind of thing. I think the way that we have militarized our police, the structure that's been cited a lot about the the unions and police advocacy organizations being unrelenting in their support of police that clearly have crossed the line. And, the police can do no wrong in their eyes. And so I think that is going to be a priority on every mayor's plate. And certainly here in Chicago, it has an abundant and very, very vocal set of community leaders that want to participate and shape what that outcome is going to be. The policing in schools and the pipeline from school to prison pipeline, all of that has got to be unpacked and rethought. I think at the center of that is a concern also for our youth and what kind of world are we creating, what kind of community are we creating for them to grow up in, what kind of opportunities are there for them, and particularly economic opportunity. It's not just employment and training, it's about entrepreneurship, it's about investing over longer periods of time in the economic development of our communities. I'm very concerned about, and I have been interested in seeing the whole discussion around trauma and mental health and how, systemic abuse and racism over long periods of time, generation after generation, how that shows up. And so what do we do to heal our communities, I think, is something that mayors need to think about. And then, it's just ghastly. Any city you go to, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, DC, the numbers of people who are without housing, without shelter, and what that creates, again, along this whole spectrum of economic opportunity, of mental health, et cetera. So that would be, my first 5 things that I would point a mayor to. And I think here in Chicago, it's going to be really, really important to involve communities in those discussions early on, and not to have policy sort of come top down, but policy that is co-created in ways that people feel some ownership and some responsibility toward helping the successful implementation of new policy.
Amina, as we close, you talk about having people across the board and from every community involved in these discussions. It's not top down. And one of the ways that we get to do that, all of us, is to be mentors and sisters and allies to other women who are engaging in various kinds of public leadership. And I know you've just done an awful lot of that throughout your career. I wonder if you would, as kind of the last topic here, share with us some of the key messages that you share, discuss with the young women who are contributing and trying to make the world better than it is.
That's a great question. I was shaped and had so many women who took an interest in me, who stepped up for me, who opened doors for me. And so I guess the first thing that I often say to young women is lift as you climb. We always looked up to the 12th graders when we were in the 9th grade, or to those who were graduating as examples of how to comport ourselves, of what to fight for, etc. So lift as you climb. Let people peek in. Find your own way of mentoring and supporting someone who's younger, or even another peer along their life's journey. Chisholm once said, "You don't make progress standing on the sidelines." And so the other thing that I encourage young women that I work with, to think about is really, how do they give service back? It's not just about you, but you as part of a continuum, you as part of a larger community. How do you get involved and get engaged? And finally, be bold, have courage. Courage, it's easy to say it. It's not always easy to speak up, to take the risk, to let people know what you're thinking, to become involved. I'm so knocked out by these young people who are leading the marches all over the country, and who are so well spoken about about racial injustice and about racial equity and what's needed. I'm just knocked out by them, and I hope that they understand that even as they are speaking, they are influencing they'll come behind them. So continue to have that courage, be bold, and lift these other young people up, include them in your process so that they can continue the work when you get tired. I think it was somebody said the other day, Dave Chappelle in his little piece said, I'm really happy the way they're driving. I'm happy to be in the back seat. So when it comes their time to be in the back seat and let the next generation drive, they should have the confidence that they taught them well. So they should have no fear about how they're going to lead them down the street.
And what a wonderful note to end on, Amina. I hope you'll come back later and join us and share more thoughts with us. But in the meanwhile, I want to say thank you, and I want to encourage our listeners, once the episode is up, do look at the links to the episode, because Amina has shared with us some wonderful recent reports about Black leadership in philanthropy and politics and civic life. I think you'll find those very useful right there, along with this great wisdom she shared with us. So thank you so much, Amina.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening, off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.